What's up, guys? It is your boy, Simone Fan 101, and I'm wearing a jacket right now because I am cold and I prefer not to die of the cold. So, just to let you know right there. This week is part 3 of Star Wars Mania. Of course, Star Wars Mania is my weekly Star Wars series where I review each and every movie. Today, we are finishing up the original trilogy by reviewing Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, released in 1983. Now, this was an important movie. The series clearly had to be. It was the end of the series, at least as far as we knew. Until later on, they were re-monikered as Episodes 4, 5, and 6, and we would eventually one day get Episodes 1, 2, and 3. Sorry about that. By the time the Episode 6 came out, Star Wars was a lot more mainstream than it was when Episode 5 came out, and George Lucas had a little bit more of a foothold in the mainstream media, and took back a little bit of the power that he kind of gave up during Episode 5's creation. He's still doing the story as he did in the first two movies, but this time he's also doing the screenplay alongside Lawrence Kasdan, replacing Lee Brackett. The director of this movie is not Irvin Kershner. As a matter of fact, it's a guy by the name of Richard Marquand, who was known for a couple other movies in the 1980s, which got critical acclaim, only a few years apart from, Star Wars Episodes 5 and 6. So clearly this guy knew how to direct. Sadly, Richard Marquand is no longer with us. God rest his soul. Produced in this movie, replacing Gary Kurtz, is a guy named, I got it in my notes here, Howard, God, his last name is fucking impossible to pronounce. Howard Kazanjian? Howard Kazanjian. That's how you say his name. So, get that out of the way right now. Howard Kazanjian. Fucking impossible for a while for me to pronounce. I had to really look at it close, even with a new pair of glasses. Anyway, how does this movie start? Well, it takes place after the events of Episode 5. No shit. We don't know exactly when it takes place after Episode 5, but we know it's at least some time, because clearly Luke Skywalker looks a little bit older. Just slightly, maybe a year or two older. Looks more mature compared to his teenage-ish years in Episodes 4, maybe even Episode 5. If you remember the events of Episode 5, Han Solo was frozen in carbonite and was taken to by the Empire. He was frozen in carbonite by the Empire and was taken to Jabba the Hutt by bounty hunter Boba Fett. Hang on a second. This is my second time trying to do this. Something's been wrong with my webcam lately. I gotta fix that. And Luke and the others attempt several plans in order to rescue Han Solo from Jabba the Hutt. The first they got Jabba out of the carbonite freezing, and due to several plans either intentionally failing or not going nearly as well as they thought it would go, eventually they rescue Han Solo from Jabba the Hutt. Jabba the Hutt dies at the hands of Princess Leia in her famous metal golden bikini. I still can't believe that was a thing. And eventually they escape Jabba's palace and kill all the guards and everything. Leia, Han, Chewie, and the others, and Lando too, as Lando is now helping the rebellion, go to join up with the Rebel Alliance so they can figure out how to destroy the Death Star, while Luke goes off to finish his training with Yoda on Dagobah. Keep in mind, he did not finish his training at Episode 5 when he went to go to confront Vader. Yoda, however, is basically sick and is now dying. Keep in mind, he's been living for 900 years. Even for an alien, that's pretty long for a guy to live. With that said, he does relay Luke some information that Luke asks. Specifically, is Vader Luke's father? Was that a trick, or was that real? And Yoda reveals that yes, Darth Vader is indeed Luke Skywalker's dad. He also reveals before his death that there is another Skywalker that, should Luke fail, could continue on to help to try to beat the Empire and, of course, the Emperor. After Yoda dies, Luke is spoken to by the ghost of Obi-Wan Kenobi, and, you know, confronts him. Confronts Obi-Wan, that is, about why he lied to him about the events surrounding his father and what happened to him. During this conversation, it's also revealed that Luke Skywalker is actually Leia's twin brother. Leia is his sister, and therefore technically should be called Leia Skywalker. But of course, Luke and Leia, they were separated at birth to be kept away from the Empire. If the Emperor figured out that, hey, if my apprentice, if my powerful Sith Lord has offspring, they could fuck us up big time. And that's exactly and that's exactly why they were separated, so that way they would not be sensed out by Darth Vader or even worse, the Emperor. Speaking of which, Darth Vader has momentarily postponed searching for Luke and is instead overseeing the reconstruction of the second Death Star. And later on, the Emperor joins him in overseeing this creation of this monstrosity. The Death Star, that is, it is settled in space, of course, above the moon of Endor. And when the Rebel Alliance finds out about this, they go and coordinate a plan in order to destroy the Death Star. First, by destroying the power source to the deflector shield. Luke eventually joins the Rebel Alliance, but soon has to leave when he senses that Darth Vader is aboard both the Death Star and the Super Star Destroyer, in space, and he goes to confront his father. He's taken up to the Emperor by his father after a brief little conversation about how Darth Vader cannot turn on the Emperor. Kind of sensing like while there's loyalty, there's also like a bit of like almost slave ownership. And Vader himself even knows this, but he knows, yeah, I can't go back anymore. I'm sorry. While this is all happening, Lando and the rest of the rebel leaders go to destroy the Death Star, while Han, Leia, Chewie, and the Ewoks go to try to destroy the power source of the deflector shield. Eventually, they succeed, and Lando and Wedge, if you even remember who the hell Wedge is, go in to destroy the Death Star by destroying, of course, the power reactor, much in the same way Luke did in Episode 4. Meanwhile, while this is all happening, Luke is engaged in a lightsaber duel with his father Darth Vader, while the Emperor watches, trying to seduce Luke to the dark side of the Force. Eventually, at one point, Luke gives in to his anger in order to defeat Vader, but noticing exactly his robot hand compared to Vader's robot hand, he decides not to join the Emperor. Of course, the Emperor tries to kill him with Sith lightning, but Darth Vader, seeing his son being tortured before his eyes, has had enough of this shit and goes to rescue his son by picking up the Emperor while the Force... More water. Like I said, the Emperor's Sith lightning is still going on, and when Vader picks him up, is mortally wounded, or should I say critically wounded, by the Emperor. And is thrown down basically a giant shaft, and because of the Sith lightning going on, he basically explodes when he comes into contact with whatever the hell he comes into contact with. Vader, like I said, is critically wounded, and during this time, Lando and Wedge succeed in destroying the main reactor core. Before the Death Star blows up, Luke tries to leave with Vader, but now the newly reformed Anakin Skywalker, his name was name-dropped by both Obi-Wan and Luke earlier in the movie, is asked Luke to take his mask off so he can see his son with his own eyes for basically the first and only time. Of course, in doing this, Anakin dies, and Luke, of course, mourns. He eventually leaves the Death Star with his father's body, and goes to the Endor where they all celebrate, but not before giving Anakin the good old Jedi treatment of being cremated. And as we would later see in Episode 1, that this, like I said, I say it because this is what the Jedi do. They cremate their fallen. And in like a show of honor. Of course, and the Empire is basically done by this point. Now, granted, yeah, you could say Disney, Star Wars, Battlefront 2, the Empire's not dead yet, it lived for another year. But in terms of the movies, the Empire was finished after the events of this movie. This movie was pretty fucking sweet. Is it as good as the first two movies? My opinion, no. I do think there are a little bit more flaws in this movie as compared to episode 5 and even episode 4. Because like I said, in my review of episode 4, even that movie, you could say, had a little bit of flaws. Small ones, but flaws nonetheless. This movie has a lot of great things to it. Before I go to the negative, let's talk about the positive, because there's a shit ton of positive. For a movie that some people might call the lighthearted one of the three, and yeah, to an extent it kind of is, it still has a lot of dark moments, and despite being the lowest on the totem pole of quality compared to its predecessors, still is a very good movie, and on top of that, still has some of the best scenes in any Star Wars movie. Darth Vader turning back into Anakin Skywalker by killing the Emperor, Leia, of course, killing Jabba the Hutt, Luke killing the Rancor, the death of Yoda. Still has a lot of great scenes that add some emotional weight and depth to them. Like Luke talking with his father before going to see the Emperor. And of course Luke finding out that Leia is his sister. And of course, when he reveals to Leia, I forgot to mention this, he reveals to Leia exactly, hey, I'm your brother, and I found this out. And by the way, Vader's our father. And by the way, thanks to this, Han Solo can finally get that sweet ass known as Princess Leia. Go Harrison Ford. I'm pretty sure Harrison Ford never did Carrie Fisher in real life, but if he did, I'd say score. I just opened up a big can of worms. Oh, I'm sorry, I should not make fun of Carrie Fisher like that, but I couldn't help myself. There are a lot of, speaking of the characters, much like in episode 5, a lot of the acting is very much on point. Harrison Ford, of course, is great as Han Solo. Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, James Earl Jones, all do great in their respective roles in this movie. Of course, you got, 3PO, R2-D2, Billy D. Williams as Lando Calrissian. You got Admiral Akbar. This was the first of 3 movie appearances from Admiral Akbar. And it just has an overall great, basically overall great acting from pretty much everybody. Another movie where there was great acting. The special effects are still very great. Probably not as good as episode 5. They try to do a little bit more here. I don't know if I can say the special effects are as good as in episode 5. In some respects they are, but in other respects they're not. There's some obvious moments of green screening. Like, for example, whenever the Rancor is shown on screen at the same time as another character, like its owner or Luke or something like that, you can tell there's some green screening there. And not like really clever green screening, but more like, it was a little bit like Godzilla-style green screening. Maybe not that bad, but just to give a kind of idea of what I'm talking about. Wait, am I talking about? What I'm supposed to be talking about the good here? Well, speaking of good, cinematography, of course, is great. John Williams does, what John Williams does, which is make fucking great music. Seriously, in terms of music, John Williams can do no wrong. And as a conclusion, it really serves very good as a conclusion to maybe not a franchise, but definitely to this trilogy. Could it serve as a conclusion of the franchise? Absolutely. But for this trilogy, it serves as a great conclusion to everything that's built up. Most things are tied up in a neat little bow. Well, a pretty good bow, maybe not a neat little bow. There are a couple things I have to bring up. I said earlier I gave all my positives. Most of the positives are in the first two movies are here. The acting, the effects, the cinematography, the story, the characters, everything is on point. Except for one little thing. It's sparse, but the execution of certain things and how they happen sometimes doesn't make sense. Like I said earlier, of course, the opening is on Tatooine, where they go to rescue Han Solo from Jabba the Hutt. Problem is, that part of the movie goes on a little bit too long. Now, granted, it's done great, so in some ways it almost negates it, but yes, it does go a little bit too long. It also doesn't help that Boba Fett, who was supposed to be portrayed as this very smart bounty hunter, someone who knew how to fight, who knew his senses, pretty much got his ass kicked at the beginning of the movie. And on top of that, why is he at Jabba's palace in the first place? He sold Han Solo to Jabba. He probably got paid. Why is he there? Why is he still there? I mean, close ties to the Empire, or some ties to the Empire, you'd think he would be the one on Endor going up against Han Solo. Now, that would have been awesome. But yeah, they did both. Yeah, Boba Fett was kind of, who was at least somewhat of an intimidating presence in Episode 5. In Episode 6, got his ass handed to him. I don't know what the hell they were doing with him here. Couple other things I gotta mention. This movie, people blame Force Awakens for doing a little bit of repeat with, people complain about doing repeat with Force Awakens when they did a very similar thing, not exactly the same, but a very similar thing here with Episode 6. Starts off on Tatooine, then we cut to the Rebel Alliance at some point, and then of course the plan to destroy the Death Star. Granted, things happen in different orders in terms of little small minute details, but yeah, it follows the overall same blueprint. One thing for Force Awakens to do that movie was made almost 40 years later. This movie was made only 6 years after the first one. Already repeating that soon, I'm like, like I said, much like with the Tatooine scene, it's executed great, but it's still there. One other thing I gotta bring up, and a lot of you might not get this, and of course, if you watch the prequels, part of this was retconned anyway, when Luke asks Leia what she remembers about her mother. Keep in mind, this was made before the prequels, so what Leia says might not exactly be accurate. Although you could say, well, the Force gave her these things, like, how does she know what her mother looks like? You could say, well, the Force did that. You know, like in dreams and such. But yeah. But that said, it's a really good scene on one end. It's a really good scene, and, you know, of course, Luke and Leia act great in it, but there are a couple of things about the scene that, in terms of details, just don't match right. I mean, it doesn't. And speaking of which, how would Luke even know about Leia's mom? There was no talk at all in the previous two movies about who Leia's parents are. We don't know about Bail Organa until Episode 2 and Attack of the Clones. So yeah, there are some details that just don't add up right in that scene. And of course, in my opinion, the biggest problem with this movie is the Ewoks. Ewoks, really? The greatest empire, the Empire, the same people that are supposedly great warriors, and supposed to be the A squad on Endor, as the Emperor at one point said. Really? The most galactic empire in all of history is defeated by a bunch of fucking teddy bears. Many people have called bullshit, and I do too. I think, personally, that is bullshit. That is bullshit. Really? Teddy bears destroy an empire that has ruled hand and fist over the entire galaxy for the past, what, 20 years? I mean, come on, that's pretty ridiculous. You have to admit that. With that being said, the execution of a lot of these things are very well done, so there are only minor inconveniences rather than major ones. The only one being an exception are the Ewoks, with the exception of maybe Wicket the Ewok. Fuck those creatures. And from what I heard, they were supposed to be Wookiees, but they couldn't find enough big men to be Wookiees, so they instead have them to be Ewoks, which, that I understand, but George Lucas still signed off on the creation of said Ewoks. And I said earlier that George Lucas was taking back a little bit of power in what he wanted to do. This was a sign of what was to come in the prequels in terms of some of the ridiculousness of things. You know, with the Ewoks and how they somehow fit into the story. Really? The Ewoks, these little kid creatures, it's like they were made to be toys. Now, granted, I didn't look up the toy line for this, but I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of Ewok toys sold back then. Remember, there used to be an Ewoks TV show. Keep that in mind. With all this being said, what do I think? Well, like I said, I think it's a very good, possibly even great movie coming out of Lucasfilm. A very satisfying conclusion, despite some flaws, to this epic space opera, that's what George Lucas calls it. Me, personally, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. Not on the level of Episode 4 or 5, but still a very good movie, even a great movie, quite possibly, that lives up to the reputation of Star Wars. Now, so, like I said, and as I said probably earlier, probably in my failed recording, honestly, one of the greatest trilogies, and not just that generation, but pretty much all generations. So, with that said, this ends my original trilogy run of Star Wars Mania. Tune in next week where I will be reviewing Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Till then, guys, see ya.